Should I start this video like I've started all the other INTP videos by talking about a deserted island? I think we'll just get off. We'll just get off the deserted island train. So thank you so much for being patient at long last with the INTPs. I always save the types that get more views or the types that prefer the most thorough videos for the end, because anytime I do a series, as time goes on, I'm going to get more insights and more ideas and a little bit more precision with my communication. So I was like, INTPs need to go toward the end. They'll appreciate a longer video and they'll also appreciate the thoroughness. So in this video, I want to go through this matrix here, this overused, underused, strength, weakness matrix. So I want to go through the INTP, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, and how do their cognitive functions play into that whole picture. So if you don't know what a cognitive function is, it's going to be really important to this video. So Myers and Briggs actually came after what Carl Jung coined in 1921, which are the cognitive functions. So these are the 8 cognitive functions here. This is by no means exhaustive, but I do have a cognitive functions playlist in the description box where I do deep dives into the definitions of all these functions. And, learning about the cognitive functions is the best way to type yourself, because a lot of the online tests are very unreliable. So I wouldn't get too attached to whatever result you got on an online test, but just dig into the cognitive functions, learn about how the positions color the personality, and type yourself in that way. So all the 16 personality types use all 8 of these cognitive functions in a specific order and in a specific way, which gives them a specific flavor. So for the INTP, this is the order in which they use these 8 cognitive functions. So I have them listed on the right-hand side and their abbreviations there as well. So loosely speaking, this is descending in order of importance to the INTP. Which ones do they value most to which ones do they value least down the line? It's not necessarily in order of strength, but value of an order of importance. And also loosely speaking, this is descending chronologically at which point these get developed within the personality type and at what point they become more of a priority within the individual. So your first cognitive function's been with you your entire life. Maybe your second function becomes more of a priority in your 20s, your third function in your 30s, your fourth function in your 40s, and so on down the line. So age can be a really important factor that colors the personality, as well as, a whole host of other things like your upbringing and things like that. But this is just kind of the default, prototypical example. To add some more nuance to this, your top 4 functions are conscious to you, so you're aware of when you use them, and you also value them in yourself and others. So even if you're not necessarily that great at it, like maybe the 4th function, you feel not great at it, but you still value it in other people. So maybe you pick a partner who has that trait because it's something you value. Your bottom 4 functions you don't tend to value in yourself and others, and you're also not conscious by default of when you use them. To add some more nuance to this, the functions in green, 1, 2, 5, and 6 are your potential strengths, and the functions in red, 3, 4, 7, and 8 are your probable weaknesses. So I said the words potential and probable because it's not 100% of the time, and age is a very significant factor which will color this. But as a default, if you're like teens, 20s, this is probably the default for how things are working. So back to what I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is where that matrix comes into play. So this matrix lives in your top 4 functions. So the 1 and 2 are the strengths, 3 and 4 are the weaknesses, and then some of them are overused and some are underused. So because the top 4 functions are conscious and valued, there's so much meat to unpack there, and that's what I'm going to spend this video unpacking. And if you're curious about where I get some of this information about the certain position, like why is the first function the most differentiated assertion of the self? Why is the third function childish and cannot be expected to offer deep wisdom? Well, that's because I took these quotes from Carl Jung, John Beebe, and Myers and Briggs in a previous video, and then I summarized them at the end of that video in these bullet points. So if you want to pause it, you can take a look at it here, but I'm not going to deeply go into those quotes like I did in the previous video because that video exists. Okay, so getting into your first cognitive function, introverted thinking, or abbreviated TI. So introvert means to turn inward, because intro means inward and vert means to turn. And Carl Jung coined the words introvert and extrovert in 1921. And he got those words, the impetus for those words from Benet's words introspection and externospection. So the difference between introvert and introspect is just that vert versus spect. So spect means to watch over. So it's to turn inward and watch what's happening inwardly. That's what introspection is. So to introvert in that moment means to turn inward and watch what's happening inwardly. And the extrovert would be the opposite. So to introvert doesn't necessarily mean to be alone, although it could be easier to introspect when you're alone, but you could be in a group of 40 people, you tune them all out, you turn inward to what's happening, and you're introspecting within that moment. In the same way, you could be alone, but you're not necessarily introverting. You might be turning outward and watching Netflix, even though you're alone. So, it's become, the definition of introvert and extrovert have become some different things, but it just means to turn inward and watch what's happening inwardly. Now, among all the things that are happening inwardly, there's a lot of options. Maybe you're concentrated on your feelings. Maybe you're tuning into the body. But in the case of introverted thinking, it's turning inward toward its thoughts and the logical criteria. What do I think about things? Is that actually true? Is this, is that a piece of clean logic? Is there any place where I could be wrong? Does this make sense to me? And it's this epistemological filter that every time something comes in, it's always going through this filter. Does this make sense to me? Does this make sense to me? Does that make sense? So everyone's first function is their overused strength. This is who you feel like you are. This is the water you swim in. This is the function that you're compelled to use. Like, you couldn't stop using this function if you wanted to. And chronologically, this is the function that's been with you your whole life. So as a child, you should see evidence of this, reserved nature, this questioning with truth and things like that. Carl Jung talks about that this dominant function is what's really life-giving and that it basically never stagnates. So in a previous series where I did deep dives into these cognitive functions, I looked at what words are repeatedly used by Carl Jung. And in the case of introverted thinking, principles is the most common word. It could be, logical principles, these principles in deduction, truth, or being a principled individual. But introverted thinking is very good at comparing systems and principles, really finding the nuance within, comparing and contrasting. What are the differences? Introverted thinking is very good at finding minute differences. And introverted thinking follows the guidance of its own opinions and convictions. It's not turning outward, but it's turning inward. What do I think about things? There could be 99 people against you, but it's really just holding the truth. One thing I say about introverted thinking a lot is that because they're so principled, it creates this integrity and it earns respect. And especially in the dominant position, this questioning that it has in this principled nature and wanting to be truthful, it earns so much respect because they question themselves and they want to make sure they're true. The best introverted thinkers, they're not just so attached to being right, but it's, wanting to be right, but it's not this attachment to being right. If they're presented with information that's wrong, they'll readily just say, oh yeah, I was wrong. And there's not emotion attached to it, which is one of the best things about introverted thinkers. There are quotes about introverted thinking that they have a lot of exactitude and scrupulousness in their work, or that their work goes slowly. So there's a lot of precision. It's a methodical pace, and that allows for these fine shades of meaning. If you go too quickly, or you skim over things, or you kind of take shortcuts, you miss all the nuance and, the specific details within something. So in whatever field they're in, I notice that, they tend to work at a relatively methodical pace. I notice that they tend to call themselves efficient, but still I would say that they're slower than a lot of people because they're more careful than a lot of people. Their communication style, this is one of the easiest ways for me to tell an introverted thinker. I pay attention for these type of clauses, but it has a lot of saving clauses, qualifications, doubts. They might say it depends a lot. So a lot of times they'll say sometimes, but not always. It could depend on this. There's a pattern for this, but it's not all the time because of this. It's kind of this idea, tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So within every sentence, kind of trying to portray the full picture. And, that makes the communication a little slower. There's more methodical, but it makes it more precise. That I think if someone was going to take a soundbite of an introverted thinker, they're going to have a much harder time portraying something inaccurate than certain types. Because, with every piece of the communication, it's so precise. Something I'll notice about their communication styles is they might say, last May I did this. Oh, excuse me, actually, it was last March that I did this. And so they'll correct themselves in communication because they want everything to be correct. And so, they might correct themselves or they might subtly correct you, but it's not in a stickler correcting people type of way. It's just oh, did you mean X? Oh yeah, okay, and then it's correcting. And there's nothing emotional about it. There's nothing punitive. It's not a regulating thing. It's just, let me make sure that I understood that properly. Okay, and then we can move on. Externally, they appear reserved, quiet, and detached. And a lot of times they seem just kind of this strong, silent type. This is very different from extroverted thinking, which is a lot more, externally, regulating. But this is reserved, quiet, detached. This is all introspecting. This is all happening within the mind. And a huge quality of introverted thinking is that it's skeptical of the validity and a critique of knowledge in general. This is that epistemological filter, that they're always just skeptical of the validity. Information comes in, and it's never accepting things at face value. Skeptical, let's question it, and then they'll assimilate it if they find that it passes the test. So a lot of times if people are feeling down or not quite like themselves, it's because they haven't given this first function the full space to thrive. This is who you feel like you are. So to not be around people who value this function can be really hard. To not make space and provide a lot of quality time with this function can be hard. So this is really important for INTPs to get into this function. So Carl Jung talks about the introversion gives you access to the self and to reflection. Because when you turn inward and introspect, that's what you're doing. If you're doing introversion well, then you know yourself more. And in this case, your thoughts thoughts more, your principles more. You should really be in tune with that and reflecting on that. And then extroversion, he says, gives you access to the world and action taking. So extroversion is not just being around a group of people, I'll reiterate again, but it's access to the world, which people are a subset of the world, but different functions key into certain things. And extroverted intuition is not necessarily extremely people-y in this case. So extroverted intuition, abbreviated NE, is your second function. So extrovert means to turn outward and watch what's happening outwardly, wanting to impact the external environment. And in this case, it's paying attention to the intuitions. So intuitions are the opposite of sensing. So sensing is what you have experienced or what you are experiencing with your senses in reality. I went to this bookstore, or look, there's a ball, or I'm feeling kind of warm. There's things that have existed. But intuition is the opposite of that. So that could be the future is not in existence yet. This could be an idea. This is something that's not in existence yet. This could be, reading between the lines. If sensing is the lines on the page, intuition is kind of connecting those things. So it's wanting to take those things, those intuitions that are not in existence, and put those in the external world. And so the number one word that get used for extroverted intuition is possibilities. It's really saying, what is not in existence and how can we expand and make so many of these possibilities in the external world as possible. So everyone's second function is their underused strength. This is something that you were born with a natural talent in, but maybe you haven't developed the skill in this function. There's a quote that this function can tend to be neglected. This function can tend to be watered down. A lot of times it can be confined to a small area of life. Like maybe you only use extroverted intuition in brainstorming, but you don't use it with friends, or you don't use it at work, or you don't, there's all these different spheres of life that we have. And, that first function really bleeds out into all of them. But the second function, sometimes we can just kind of confine it to a small area and say, oh yeah, I use that function a lot because I use it a lot in this one area. But it's important to really let it bleed out into all areas of life. And a lot of times it can also be used in an introverted way. This is an extroverted function, but since you're an introvert, there can be a tendency to kind of warp it and do it in a very introverted way. Like, oh yeah, I'll explore possibilities, but I'll do it, just like at home on my computer very quietly while I'm thinking to myself and kind of introspecting to myself. It's not the full extent of like really getting out there in the world. So Carl Jung talks about the second function adds complexity to the type. When you're just that first function growing up, it can be kind of one-dimensional. And then teens, 20s, this one starts to take a more prominent role and you become more of a complex, well-rounded individual. So the number one word used with extroverted intuition is possibilities, and it's in the plural form. It's not just like what's the one possibility, but really wanting to expand lots of different possibilities. And there are quotes about it wants to encompass possibilities, fresh possibilities, seeking possibilities, new possibilities, searching for possibilities, discovering possibilities. It's always on this hunt to be creating all of these different external possibilities. Imagination is something like when I think of Disney and I think about all of the different Disney movies or anime, for example, these started in the mind with the imagination, and you just look at all the different routes Disney has gone. Or you look at like fantasy books or like Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or just all these different things. Those started in the mind as the imagination, and we just branched out into all these different worlds. There are quotes that extroverted intuition is expectant. It sees the future as promising. It's eager to get into it. So it's very optimistic toward the future. There are certain functions that are kind of pessimistic toward the future, and this one is incredibly optimistic about the future. And so, kind of a switch is to think about, if for you this function's kind of watered down or you're neglecting this function, instead of thinking about what's the worst that can happen in the future, think about what's the best that could happen. And that's the frame of extroverted intuition. And it's not just what's the one best thing that could happen, what are lots of the best things that could happen, brainstorm a lot of positive ideas that could happen. Extroverted intuition is really attracted to novelty. It's very changeable. It loves the new things, the initiation of new enterprises like new projects. It's on the everlasting search for change. That's a key quote with extroverted intuition, this everlasting search for change, because extroverted intuition views the everyday situation as like a prison that it needs to be let out from. And the change and the new thing and the invention, that's what lets it out, and it's what animates this function. So I'll notice with NE DOMs, who just, they're compelled to use this function, it basically never stagnates, that a lot of times their life is characterized by lots of change. That could be like new cities, repeatedly moving across the country. This could be lots of different jobs. They're a lawyer for a while, they do sales for a while, they do construction for a while, military for a while, where they can move around in the military. Trying lots of different hobbies, traveling to lots of different places, inventing in their spare time, trying different technology. So an everlasting search for change. So I think like as a function, if you're really wanting to work on this function, because it's like your underused strength, work on like searching for more change. How can you change things up? So extroverted intuition, it's enthusiastic, animated, full of the joy of life. And so I think sometimes people can start feeling kind of like down, but this function is what gives so much joy of life. So the question might be like, well, how do I get some more of the joy of life? How do I just get more of that enthusiasm genuinely? But if you do extroverted intuition things, trying all these new possibilities, exploring all these different routes, that enthusiasm naturally follows. When I look at INTPs who have really spent their life just doing the one same old thing, which can happen, kind of this stagnant, passive type life, they really seem like they're kind of sucked full of the joy of life. Because for the INTP, it's this extroverted intuition that will give you that joy of life and that enthusiasm. So when I look at the INTPs, like I know some INTPs that they have moved a bunch. One who lives in Brazil and he speaks 3 languages, and he was in tech for a while, and then he was a principal for a while, and they seem much more merry and full of the joy of life. Extroverted intuition is very clever, active in mind, and problem solving. So in looking to the future, think about like you have the problem solving skills that you need. I think sometimes change seems kind of like scary. I don't want to get into this active stance. I just want to kind of stay kind of passive. But extroverted intuition is very clever, and there are quotes about how extroverted intuition will just make nothing of the problems that others have really struggled with. They've really struggled with something for a long time, but for extroverted intuition, it's just they're very good, very active in mind. As opposed to extroverted sensing, like an ISTP, they're very active in body. Well, they have a tendency to neglect it as well, but extroverted intuition is very active in mind. There's a quote for extroverted intuition that he applies himself to callings where he can expand his abilities in many directions. So I think it's really good for an INTP to do some sort of career that will allow you to go down a lot of different veins, or, switch. You do one career for a while, then you do another one, then you do another one, and, just really allow yourself to be multi-passionate. For some people, they give the advice, like, you need to niche down, find the one thing, and that's really good advice for some people, and a lot of times it's ETJs giving that advice, which is really good advice for them. They had to learn to find the one thing. But for INTPs, I don't think that that's the best advice, to really, like, niche down and find the one thing. Like, being multi-passionate, make sure it doesn't get stale. I think for an INTP, doing that one thing over and over and over again starts to get kind of stale. So this is a function that I recommend everyone work on for like 5 years because it tends to be neglected, but Carl Jung says it lends so much range and prospect and satisfaction. And I've seen so much evidence of that in my own life and my husband's life, and a lot of YouTube comments. People say that when they get into that second function, it just feels like coming home to themselves. And like the horizons just broadened up because you're an INTP, not an ISTP. So to neglect this function gets rid of a huge part of who you are. And Carl Jung says that this function is of secondary importance. And so it's really important to, put it on that level. It's secondary importance. So, when you prioritize your time, spend second priority on extroverted intuition. So John Beebe calls this function the parent. And when you think about what a good parent does, it's mature, it sets expectations for the self, boundaries for others, and for the child, which I'll get to in a moment. But this is where people can be responsible and really kind of fulfill their calling. And it's kind of paradoxical because extroverted intuition I associate as it's very childlike function. It's very radiant and enthusiastic, but counterintuitively, it's your responsibility to get into this function. It is irresponsible of you to not be in this very childlike state, which is very counterintuitive. I said this for the ISTPs as well. I said this for all the IPs. It's kind of counterintuitive, the second function, but it is so important, and it's your responsibility to get into this function. This is where you really impact people. And I love the Brene Brown quote, like, find what lights you up and do more of that thing because the world needs more people who are lit up. And when I think of extroverted intuition, I just imagine like this lit upness, this radiant enthusiasm. And so it is your responsibility and duty to the world to get into that extroverted intuition. So now to introverted sensing, your third function. So everyone's third function is the direct opposite of their second function. Since your second function is extroverted, this one's introverted. Since your second one is intuition, this one is sensing. So introverted sensing is your third function. And since your second function was your underused strength, the opposite of that is your overused weakness. There's really a tendency to be pulled down into this function. And the reason is because you're an introvert and this is an introverted function, so there's a tendency to indulge there. But the thing is that when you spend too much time in that space, Carl Jung talks about the dangers of getting too one-sided. And for certain types, too much introversion can become like navel gazing. You run out of things to, be meaningfully interacting with, or you're hunting for the truth, but when you cut yourself off to experiences, you cut yourself off from the full truth. For, extroverts, sometimes they can like lose themselves in the world. So Carl Jung talks about the dangers of one-sidedness. So that's why this function is not of secondary importance. And there are quotes about this function cannot be expected to offer deep wisdom. It's immature. John Beebe calls this the child function. It's the immature boy. Like it just never grows up. And I think of this function kind of like a bratty teenager. It pushes and pushes and it wants to be respected. And I hear from people time and time again, no, my third function is pretty good. And, and I'm perceiving them like, I don't think it is. But, from the individual's perspective, people perceive it to be be better than it is. So your second and third function, they're called a polarity. They're on a pole with each other on an axis. They're opposites of each other. It's like the North Pole and the South Pole, or it's like a light switch. Light switch is either flipped on to NE or flipped down to SI. And the thing with these, because they're opposites, it's a forced choose. You're either an NE or you're an SI. If you try to like flip the light switch down to the middle, you're not really getting the meaningful results of either. And Carl Jung talks about you need to differentiate these functions. You need to pull them apart, not mix them together. So, you could rapidly switch light switch on and off, but that's not really going to give you a good result. So for every second you choose to be an SI, you're choosing not to be an NE, which is another reason why it's so unfortunate to be in this function, because you're an INTP, not an ISTP. So this function is the child function. It's immature. A lot of times people go to this function in an argument or when they're feeling insecure, or when they're feeling kind of down. This really stagnates an INTP. So your third function is introverted sensing. So introvert means to turn inward, and senses means to pay attention to what you have experienced, what you are experiencing. It's an internal processing of those things. So that could be, it goes kind of two routes. One route is it goes down the body route, this internal processing of the sensory experience. Am I too hot? Am I too cold? Am I hungry? Do I need more water? Making sure that the body is, can be about making sure the body's comfortable. The other route that it goes when you're talking about an internal processing of your experiences is that's basically combing back through your memories. You're processing your memories. How did this impact you? This Rolodex, these chapters add up into this book of your life and how these experiences have formed you. So a lot of times with this third position, you'll take on a lot of the negative traits of a function, or if there was a positive trait, maybe it gets kind of twisted in combination with your first function, because there's a tendency to loop within those first and third functions and kind of neglect that second function. So the number one word used with introverted sensing is archaic and reserved. So there are quotes about introverted sensing sees an archaic reality. So every time it's looking at something, it's, filtering it through this kind of past-oriented lens. Or there's quotes about, this million-year-old consciousness, this age-old subjective experience. So it's not necessarily having a good memory. Everyone, and that's just part of the human experience to be able to remember things. But it's an orientation on that thing. It's constantly focused on that age-old experience and on the past. But what this can be is it's estranged from reality and poor comparative judgment. So when you think about archaic, sometimes that can be just kind of outdated. It's this outdated reality. It's estranged from reality and poor comparative judgment. Like sometimes I'll see INPs over-glamorize the past, like maybe they were in a past relationship and then the person broke up with them and then they really kind of idealize that, and it's poor comparative judgment to the present. Or in the reverse, maybe they just really like demonize it, like it was really bad. So it's an archaic reality, and it's not living with what the current moment is. Sometimes with introverted sensing, I feel that it has a hard time catching up to what the new thing is. Like maybe there was a certain person who had a certain reputation 3 years ago, and it takes introverted sensing a while to kind of catch up that, people change, people don't stay the same forever. But introverted sensing just kind of has this belief that things do not change, which I'll get to later. And so it's not really seeing things accurately. It has an outdated view of things sometimes. There were many quotes about introverted sensing being passive. That is a huge word with introverted sensing, as well as archaic and reserved, but very passive. The enthusiastic is damped, and it brings things within the necessary bounds, like things are kind of bound up. So introverted sensing being the exact opposite of extroverted intuition. Extroverted intuition is very actively and proactively putting these possibilities in the external environment. And it's very enthusiastic about all these possibilities. Whereas introverted sensing take this passive stance to life, and it's kind of like, let's not get too excited. Let's dampen things a little bit, and let's bring this within the necessary bounds. Let's not, go too crazy with all these possibilities. Let's bring it in here. So it really just it almost becomes banal. It makes this very excitable extroverted intuition. It makes it just very commonplace, and it kind of dampens the potential of the INTP. Other quotes, that introverted sensing will kind of acquiesce in isolation. You combine that with introverted thinking. That can be a lot of, the stereotype might be like a lot of computer time, for example. Introverted sensing is very timid, has a lot of caution, puts up a protective shield. It has a flair for every dangerous and gloomy possibility. So, extroverted intuition, being the opposite of this, it throws caution to the wind. It's not putting up a protective guard. It's like, I'll try this. What's the best that can happen? It's not thinking about what's the worst that can happen. Whereas introverted sensing, it's got this flair for what's the worst that can happen, the gloomy possibilities. And so it's putting up a shield and caution for that thing. And a lot of times it's based on outdated information, when you talk about introverted sensing in the third spot. So introverted sensing is very comfort seeking. So, I've got pictures here of this person with like the coffee or cuddled up in the blanket on the computer, or they're eating their potato chips on the couch. It's good to be comfortable, but when it's in this third position, it's just so stagnant, and it's just incredibly comfort seeking, like not wanting to do anything outside of the comfort zone or anything new. Extroverted intuition is kind of the definition of outside of the comfort zone. It's exploring so many possibilities. The quotes with introverted sensing, it can be kind of banal, it's kind of ordinary, commonplace, doing things every day in the same old way, not switching it up. On the bottom left, we've got a picture of this guy on the computer, he's plugging in his stuff, doing everything in the same old way. Yesterday looks like the day before it, looks like the day before it, looks like the day before it, it's the opposite of extroverted intuition, whose life is characterized by change. Introverted sensing has a belief, I cannot change. And there were quotes in introverted sensing about they really believe in fate and predestination, almost that they have the inability to change. And so they have a passive resistance to anything new. It's not, introverted sensing doesn't tend to like actively resist things, but just kind of passively, I'll just kind of stand back. Maybe this change will blow over. Maybe they'll get a different idea that I like a little bit more. Their mental life is formed by early experience. This is one of the quotes. Introverted sensing is really oriented toward its past experiences and how its past experiences have shaped it. So sometimes, the mental life becomes really formed by that. Maybe childhood was rough and then there's, a lot of that is still lingering on, or they were in a bad relationship and that's still lingering on. And so it's kind of important to, get out and change and realize that things have changed. Maybe your mental life hasn't changed and, in your mind, you're stuck in whatever was happening 10 years ago. But, look around into the world, try somewhere new, somewhere different. Another quote with introverted sensing is it has a difficulty understanding its own potential or worth. Because when you think about potential, that's something that's not in existence. That's one of those intuitive things, it's future existence. So introverted sensing has a hard time understanding its own potential or worth. But when you get into extroverted intuition, it sees potential everywhere. Like there's lots of potential everywhere. The individual has lots of routes that they could go. So it really extends the bounds. So this function is your overused weakness, and it's not all bad. It's kind of like a bratty teenager, and bratty teenagers are not all bad, not by any stretch of the imagination. Teenagers are really good like in a time of recreation. If you want to like reminisce on your memories, or you look through a photo album or something, to do that sometimes, that's totally fine, as long as it subordinates itself to extroverted intuition, because extroverted intuition is the parent and introverted sensing is the child. So in an appropriate parent-child dynamic, the parent calls the shots and will delegate things to the child, not the other way around. So if extroverted intuition wants to delegate things to introverted sensing, then that's totally fine. But extroverted intuition is of secondary importance, and so it's important to really make it the secondary importance. You don't want to be 50% of the time NE, 50% of the time SI. You really want to be getting that up higher into extroverted intuition, because that's the green zone, that's your strength, that's where the maturity lives. Introverted sensing cannot be expected to offer deep wisdom, so don't rely on it for decision-making power. One thing that I've said in all the videos with all the types is I think a third function is what can make people involuntarily single. So if they're single but they don't want to be, because I think people want to be a mature person and to find a mature person, and this third function is not where the maturity lives. It cannot be expected to offer deep wisdom. And so for every second you're in introverted sensing, which is not offering deep wisdom, you're not in extroverted intuition, which is giving you the range and the prospect. And so I think that, it cuts people off from maturity in different ways if they're in their third function too much. So yeah, allow extroverted intuition to parent it, and make sure that, ideas originate with NE and not with SI. Sometimes ideas can actually originate with SI, like, oh, we've been doing it like this. Yesterday we did this, and the day before we did this, and the day before we did this, and that was working. So maybe I'll just like tweak that a little bit. And so, NE gets tacked on at the end. As opposed to starting with NE, let's brainstorm all these tons of different things, and on this very new thing that I've never done before, is there something I can apply from my past to it? So, making sure that the order is correct. Okay, so now your last function, extraverted feeling. So everyone's fourth function is the direct opposite of their first function. They're a polarity, just like the second and third functions are a polarity. So since your first function is introverted, this one's extroverted. Since your first one is thinking, this one's feeling. So extraverted feeling is your fourth function. So to extrovert means to turn outward and watch what's happening outwardly. And in this case, it's watching the feeling environment. Are we in harmony with one another? Do we have good rapport? Does anyone need anything? Is there anything I can do to kind of make this a better emotional environment externally? So since your first function is your overused strength, this one is your underused weakness. So your third function's a weakness because you use it too much, but this one's a weakness because you use it not enough. When you think about this polarity, you can either be in TI or in FE. If that first function's who you feel like you are and your number one strength, and it basically never stagnates, that means you're basically never down there in FE. You're like 95% of the time TI, 5% of the time FE. And John Beebe calls this fourth function your inferiority complex. So that creates even more timidity and like vulnerability to get into this function. And it's true that we're not great at our fourth function, but we're not as bad as we think we are. It's really an inferiority complex. So to sprinkle it in a little more is actually really helpful, because a lot of types have the belief my first function and my first function only will get me what my first function wants. And this tends to actually create a prison, and the key to getting out of that prison is your fourth function. It will kind of unlock it. So for every second you're turning inward and thinking about things, do they make sense to you? You're not turning outward and seeing how the emotional environment is, because they're opposites. So it can kind of create a lack in a certain area of vulnerability and insecurity to go to this place. So the number one word used with extroverted feeling is harmony. And the number one goal for people who have FE highly is the formation of harmonious relationships. That's all they're trying to do. They constantly have this aim. So, I've got pictures here. These are very FE pictures. You've got on the bottom right, people gathered around a table. A lot of times it's centered around food, because food really brings up the harmony. So I think if you want to work on this function a little bit, kind of a byproduct, like a way to do this is work on cooking, because I think that's something that brings people together, or putting together a charcuterie board or a wine basket or barbecue or something like that. Maybe get into cooking a little bit as a way to kind of build these relationships. Too much TI. There are quotes in Introverted Thinking that it can be stubborn, difficult to convince it's mistaken, hubris. Extroverted Feeling, on the opposite of that, is very adaptable to praise and criticism, and it takes praise and criticism very seriously. It says Extroverted Feeling, as well as Extroverted Thinking, they're willing to adjust their methods for whatever outcome they want. So if Extroverted Feeling wants this harmonious outcome, and people said, this didn't work for me, they'll say, okay, well, no problem, I'll reroute, and I'll do it that way, and it'll still get me the same outcome. So I think that'd be good for TI users to use Extroverted Feeling and to take in whatever people say. And I think sometimes for TI DOMs, they feel very insecure about Extroverted Feeling, and I don't think it's as bad as they think it is, actually. Listen to, the feedback that you get from people. I think it's vulnerable to open yourself up to feedback. That's the vulnerability with TE and FEs. You really open yourself up to feedback from the group. But listen to that and adapt to their praise and criticism. TI, as well as FI, can be too prideful and say, well, the group's wrong. If they don't like the way I did it, then who cares what they think? I'm just going to keep doing it my way. But you got to think about, what is the element of truth in what they're saying, or what's the middle ground with what I think and what they think. Extroverted Feeling is very good at finding the middle ground. I once had an ISFJ tell me, she's like, even if you 95% disagree with something that someone said, find the 5% that you do disagree with. And she's like, sometimes it's very difficult to kind of wiggle your way. How can I find the thing I do agree with about this thing, and then move the conversation in that way? There are quotes about Introverted Thinking about feeling very awkward, ridiculous, gauche. And then there are quotes of Extroverted Feeling, conversely, that they always know the right thing to say. And so I think some of this, if Introverted Sensing, is very timid and cautious, and too much Introverted Feeling is kind of awkward and feels ridiculous, that's really hard in a social situation. But conversely, like NE and FE are incredibly great in social situations. NE gives you a lot of enthusiasm. FE always knows the right thing to say. So sprinkling some of this in is really helpful. This function becomes more of a priority, especially in your 40s. And when I look at INTPs who are 40s and up, they actually have a lot of charisma. This is something I think that younger INTPs, they're like, what? I don't feel like that might be true. But I wanted this smiley face here, this guy with the glasses, I wanted that to represent kind of charisma. It's kind of creepy looking, but I wanted it to represent charisma. There are quotes of Introverted Thinking that they'll talk themselves out of their feelings, like in a dating environment, and that they have a vague dread of the opposite sex. It's just part of this like awkward, feeling like weird. But Extroverted Feeling is very useful in social contacts, very good at building rapport. It knows exactly what's appropriate for the moment. If the outcome they want is harmony, in this environment, these methods might work, but then in this environment, these methods might work. So, it's really adjusting for what's appropriate to the moment. It'll change its methods to get the result that it wants. There are quotes of Introverted Thinking about it feels timid and uncertain. And this as well as Introverted Sensing. Introverted Sensing also has that exact word, timid and cautious. So there's kind of a double dose of this timidity. But there are quotes of Extroverted Feeling that add some charisma and warmth. And Extroverted Feeling creates community. So this is where you can build friendships, family, you can join a club. So this is a very people-oriented function, but, do it in a way that works for you. You don't have to do the stereotypical Extroverted Feeling with like inviting people over to a dinner party or something. If that doesn't like feel like that's going to make sense for you, don't do that. It could be like having, if you're into board games, it could be, joining a board game club. Something that like for whatever your interests are, do it in a way that makes sense for you. I think something that works for basically most people is food. I think that's the unifying factor. So I think kind of a hack for INTPs is, learn how to cook, Extroverted Intuition, a little Introverted Sensing, learn these new recipes. That's not quite the full extent of extroverted intuition, but learning new recipes I think could be something that could be actually fun for an INTP, especially the older ones I know actually do tend to get into cooking. So I read in a Marie von Franz book that you don't really know someone, or she said something kind of adjacent to this that kind of sparked this in my mind, but you don't really know someone until you know their fourth function. Like maybe when you meet someone, you meet their first or second functions, then their third function, but you're not really friends with someone until you meet their fourth function. That's when you know you went from acquaintances to friends. Like you crossed a new threshold because it's vulnerable for people to go to that fourth function. So you peeled back a layer of vulnerability when you see people's fourth function. I feel like I really know a TI Dom when they reveal to me that they feel kind of like awkward in these extroverted feeling situations, or if they do like cook you a meal, that's kind of surprising, or if they bring you like a thoughtful gift or like a thank you, like kind of these FE type little like token type things. I feel like I've like crossed a threshold, and so I'm always so grateful when people show me their fourth function, because it's not just your first function, and your first function only will get you what your first function wants, but all these four functions are kind of like tools that can be called upon for the right job. So like, am I in a social environment? Okay, FE is the right tool for the job. Am I in more of like a logical environment? Okay, TI is the right thing for the job. Do I want to try something new? Do I want to travel or learn a new language? Okay, then NE is the right tool for the job. So trying to fit like your dominant function into every single task that you come upon can be like fitting a square peg into a round hole. You don't have to be like an extroverted feeling Dom. You don't need to be 50-50 TI-FE. But instead of like 95% of the time in TI, maybe try to be like 80% of the time in TI and 20% of the time in FE. And as well as, when you think about percentages for the second and third function, I think a lot of people are way more in their third function than they are in their second function, I would say, as a default, especially for younger people. So, instead of being an introverted sensing more than extroverted intuition, really try to bump that so that extroverted intuition is taking the secondary priority, like Carl Jung says, and not that third function. So if you're interested in more videos about the INTP personality type, I will have my INTP playlist linked in the description box. It's all the videos I've ever done about INTPs, including things that could be relevant to INTPs, like the deep dives on these cognitive functions. So you can go ahead and check that out in the description box. Wow, we did it. I got done with this series. The series has taken so long. I really appreciate your guys' patience. I always want, for INTPs, they're such a thorough type, and I want to make sure that, as the series goes on, I'll get more insights and, learn better ways that I can phrase things a little bit more precisely. And, my phrasing never gets as precise as like a TI Dom, but I'm like, I gotta like try at least to get these like TI Dom types toward the end so that I've got a little bit more precision. So I hope that you found it thorough. If you compare this video to the very first video in the series, much different length of time, I'm sure, much more extent to what's in these bullet points and things like that. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.